Examples how pathological demand avoidance PDA profile of autism seems to be constructed. It seems to be a constructed category by Richard Woods at London South Bank University PhD student. I do have some conflicts of interest, which I'm not going to linger on. This information is publicly available. A bit more about my kind of biases and perspective. I am diagnosed as autistic in 2012. I do meet Elizabeth Newton's PDA profile, but I'm not emotionally attached to it, and I'm presently no longer basing my identity on diagnostic categories. Um, well, as much as I can do in practical terms. I'm equally respecting divergent views and evidence to critically synthesise appropriate interpretations on PDA. My PhD is investigating PDA as part of the critical autism/disability studies research group at London South Bank University. This is my interpretation of the PDA and its literatures. Others may disagree. I may sometimes use medical model-based language, but that's more because it's from the source material than I agree with it, because I intrinsically recognise that the kind of psychiatric categories are social constructs. So, yeah, moving on. So, there will be a few topics in this video. So, but I'm going to first point out that this is mainly aimed to be an introductory video on the topic. There are other examples which show that PDA Profile of Autism is socially constructed mainly through methodology and axiological kind of methods. But these are a few ones that I have often used in my work and kind of recent reflections online on the topic. So, yeah, this talk should be about 30 minutes ish, and it has about 6 topics in there. So, the first one will be the PDA features continua diagram. I will briefly talk about factors that kind of indicate that PDA is socially constructed before moving on to 3 examples. So, one is the kind of the socially manipulative to avoid socially manipulative / strategic avoidance trait change. The autism social communication categories kind of history, which I kind of get onto later. Kind of autism, anxiety, and PDA will be the final example, and then I'll be ending on with some reflective kind of questions. So, yeah, people who are familiar with my more recent work should have seen this diagram before. So it's basically presenting the PDA features as series of continua within, just a series of continua. So you have red and green arrows represent each kind of continua. So the green end is that it's less of a problem or not a problem, while the red end is obviously it's more of an issue to being quite highly impaired sometimes. So you got anxiety, kind of avoidance of auditory demands, bullying, harassment, lying, stalking, stealing, etc., to fantasy and role play, impulsivity, obsessive behaviour, that's meant to be focused on other people, a kind of need for control or drive for autonomy in brackets, kind of rapid mood changes, reinforcement-based approaches such as applied behaviour analysis, positive behaviour support, kind of socially strategic to manipulative kind of avoidance behaviour and theory of mind. On the left-hand side, you have PDA Profile of Autism, and on the right-hand side, you have so right and end of the continua, you have like classical or more straightforward autism. I would look at it slightly differently. I would say that the right-hand side is mainly just autism, and the left-hand side is features of co-occurring difficulties like ADHD, obsessional disorder, anxiety, conduct disorder, and trauma-related features. Please do not verify this diagram. It has problematic aspects like saying that like applied behaviour analysis and positive behaviour support are effective with autistic people. A lot of autistic people would take umbrage with that. So, yeah, we know from within the autism literature that it is how it's currently kind of operationalized and how it's kind of attributed towards people is that there is a male bias in its kind of clinical descriptions and in like the prevalence rates. And in the kind of tools that are used. So, and this is kind of constructed through kind of methodological and axiological assumption, kind of axiology of how autism research is conducted and how the autism is kind of attributed towards people. So this is from from a recent systematic review looking at barriers to diagnosing autistic females. So there's a methodological bias resulting from the inclusion of predominantly male samples, as well as the use of clinical tools designed to fit a male autism presentations. The stereotype of autism is a boy's disorder, and we know that like a clinician's bias is a barrier to diagnosing autistic females. Males are many more times more likely to be referred than females, and when autism features are comparable levels, females are less likely to be attributed with autism to males. And there's also the issues of autistic females are often kind of missed, as in just not picked up, being attributed with autism, kind of, or diagnosed later in life, or are kind of misdiagnosed with categories like borderline personality disorder. So, but when you kind of look at PDA Profile of Autism, there seems to be similar processes occurring to construct it in similar ways. So it should be noted that so far we have approached this profile from a starting point of our expertise in autism. As I'll show you later in this talk, that it's quite debatable around what the expertise of autism is with some of the claims and what they're doing with PDA, but that's a bit of a tangent. This is a quote from the PDA Society. As a result of this broadening of the way that autism and the autism spectrum is seen, the contributor's view is that PDA is currently best understood as a profile or cluster of traits on the autism spectrum. So we also have examples of investigating population prevalence in autistic persons, exploring PDA behaviour profiles in suspected autistic persons. That's like a clinical sample from a private clinic. And also kind of attempting to initially validate screening and diagnostic tools for PDA. So that's the Extreme Demand Avoidance Questionnaire, there's Extreme Demand Avoidance Questionnaire 8, and 11 revised PDA DISCO items. The DISCO is the semi-structured interview designed to assess and attribute autism by the National Autistic Society. These are all kind of meant to be validated, I suppose, in tiny autistic samples. So anyone familiar with my previous video will note that I would say there's at least some non-autistic people in the NAQ initial validation study and the 11 revised PDA DISCO IM study, but moving on. So the ANOSA 2016A, which is the study which initially validated these 11 revised PDA DISCO items, the authors of that assumed PDA was a meaningful autism subgroup, and they arbitrarily decided that it is seen in less than 30% of autistics, which I obviously have issues with. Finally, this is a quote from the PDA Society, which is it's from a document which it claims to be clinical guidance. I think it's a highly biased research report, but it's basically telling you how you should be kind of attributing PDA and what kind of clinical language you should be using. So within their autism diagnosis, there's a range of terminology that is used in formulations, including autism with PDA profile / pathological demand avoidance profile, to add demand avoidance profile / add profile of demand avoidance, to and the last one is extreme / pervasive demand avoidance. So that's from page 20 on the PDA Society's document I'm referring to. So you can start going into examples of other indicators which show that PDA profile of autism is constructed. So in one of my recent essays that's published, I showed that the PDA traits have changed over time to become autism-like. And we know this because the PDA literature, especially from before around 2015, was quite commonly stating that it's problematic viewing PDA to be autism due to various issues such as the manipulative social avoidance behaviours indicate intact empathy, or it's got role playing pretend, or it's got different strategies, etc., etc. So I'm going to just give an example of one of these trait changes, specifically focusing on the social manipulative kind of avoidance behaviours one. So Neeson rated as strategies of avoidance are essentially socially manipulative. That's from page 597, and that changed in Owens et al. 2016A to strategies of avoidance that are essentially socially manipulative, and that's socially manipulative in quotation marks. So that's already kind of denoting that it's not actually manipulative. And the final example is from the National Autistic Society's website, but it's quoted from Green et al. 2018A paper. So this is uses social strategies as part of avoidance, e.g. distracting, giving excuses. So you can kind of see that this non-autism feature of PDA that is meant to be, that it's got manipulative avoidance behaviours, has just been changed to become autism-like with strategic. This is quite problematic. So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes. This is from Fiddler and Christie's 2019 book. So this was combined with sufficient social understanding and sociability, to enable the child to be socially manipulative, and that's social manipulative in quotation marks from Fiddler and Christie, but in their avoidance. So the next quote is, they are also able to use social strategies in attempts to avoid demands in a way that this was described as being socially manipulative, but others tend to describe as being socially strategic. So what they seem to be suggesting is that there's some kind of equivalence between what Newton described as manipulative and strategic, which I'm kind of going to get into, delve into that a bit more. So this is what Newton said about the manipulative avoidance behaviours and general around their kind of PDA's empathy level. So at first sight, normally sociable, but with enough empathy to manipulate adults as shown above, but ambiguous and without depth. No sense of responsibility, not concerned with what is fitting to her age, and so in brackets might pick fight with a toddler, close brackets, despite social awareness, manipulative behaviour. Despite social awareness, behaviour is uninhibited. And there's another quote which is like, because motivation to avoid demands is so sustained, and because the child knows no boundaries to avoidance. And this is all from like page 597, where she's kind of actually describing her kind of behaviour profile. So, and this actually makes sense because this is a diagram from page 599 of Newton 2003, and this is how Newton conceptualised PDA versus autism. And this is her own version of post-mental disorders diagram. I've got a table later on in this talk which notes the full difference. But the point that matter here is that PDA is not autism. It's quite clearly not overlapping the autism spectrum, which is from Newton viewed Asperger's syndrome and kind of autistic disorder to the autism spectrum, and PDA isn't it. You'll notice that the autism spectrum is based on childhood impairment, which makes sense from being around 30 years ago, and PDA is not based on the autism spectrum, and you'll notice that the autism spectrum has the remind issues and empathy issues, while PDA has social manipulation, obviously kind of basically kind of targeting people. It's also quite interesting in terms of the obsessive behaviour is more focused on demand avoidance and secondary kind of targeting people with kind of like harassment, etc., than it being naturally focused on people. So this is kind of consistent view from Newton that PDA has relatively intact, if not just full intact, through of mind and empathy, while autism does not. And I'm going to go on to this. So these are this is from a table that got published in the same essay where I'm kind of describing how PDA traits evolved over time. And these are a list of example items from various PDA tools that show that these behaviours are done with intent, done to kind of omit stuff. So it ranges from kind of being good at getting around others and making them do as he or she wants, to kind of I blame or target a particular person, to kind of lie, cheat, steal, cause them distress, to does they ever threaten to hurt himself or do things to him hurt self? Is this behaviour impulsive, or does A do it on purpose to show he or she is in control, cause distress or get attention? So these are not all the examples. You can pause the slide to kind of see all of them, or see the link in the description to the actual essay in particular. But it's quite clear that at least some of the PDA behaviours are done deliberately with kind of understanding of what's happening. So what that kind of means is, I would also point out that if something is done strategic, is strategic in nature, it's done as part of a strategy. If something's done as part of a strategy, it's done deliberately, because like a strategy is a document or something that you've deliberately put together as it's a plan. So if the behaviour is strategic, it's done deliberately with intent. There's also research which suggests that PDA features are not related to theory of mind issues, while autism is, which kind of supports Newton's theories on the topic, which is a PhD thesis at Bishop 2018. So in my view, social manipulative equals socially strategic, but not for the reasons that PDA Profile of Autism advocates would suggest. So, to me, I would say the PDA seems to have at least either intact socialization stuff or very very mildly impaired. But this kind of like begs the question, like, where does strategic avoidance behaviours originate from within the PDA literature? And we actually know where. So they first pop up in this 2018 article by Anil Patel, 2018. So what they did is they had, off the top of my head, they had 22 kind of cases. That's caregiver reported cases of autistic children or suspected autistic children with PDA. They asked them a 22-item semi-structured interview, and then they coded the data with the 11 revised PDA disco items. But this is kind of, the last part is important because 2018, the United Health 2018 paper is a replication study of a United Health 2015, and the United Health 2015 is, from my understanding, chapter 5 from Anil's PhD thesis. And that study uses the same 22-item semi-structured interview to interview about 14 caregivers for their views on their children or persons suspected of having PDA. And the original study viewed the social demand avoidance to be manipulative. So, just quoting the abstracts, examples suggest social insight sufficient to use targeted social manipulation. Which said, so why is there a difference from the first study to the second study? Why is the first one got manipulative and the second one got strategic? And as I said previously, it's because the second study coded their interview data with these 11 revised PDA disco items. And it matters because there's one item in these 11 PDA disco items which is called apparently manipulative behaviour. And it matters if you use code this interview data. Because avoidance behaviour cannot be manipulative if you've got an apparently descriptor in front of it. So you've got to call it something else, because you can't call it strategic, because it can't be manipulative because it's only apparently. So they have to use the term strategic instead. So that's where it comes from. So I'm arguing that the strategic kind of avoidance behaviours is a result of the methodology and the axiology used within the United Health 2018 paper more than it actually is not manipulative avoidance behaviours. So I'm going to go into the second example, which is as a result of this broadening of the way that autism and the autism spectrum are seen, the contributor's view is that PDA is currently best understood as a profile, or in brackets, or a cluster of traits, close brackets, on the autism spectrum. So that's from this PDA cited document, which it claims to be clinical guidance. I think it's a highly biased research report. And I'm going to challenge this kind of claim by theirs. So this is a table I mentioned earlier, and it's comparing the DSM-IV pervasive mental disorders diagnostic grouping versus Newson-Tell's pervasive mental disorders diagnostic grouping. And so on the left-hand side, you've got the accepted DSM-IV version, right-hand side, you've got Newson-Tell. And they're different. So the first one is a DSM-IV pervasive mental disorders grouping. It has different categories in versus Newson's. So for DSM-IV, it has Asperger's syndrome, Rett syndrome, childhood disintegrated disorder, autistic disorder, and pervasive mental disorder not otherwise specified. While Newson-Tell has autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, and PDA, specific language impairments, which include things like dysphagia and dyspraxia. Sorry, not dyspraxia, dyslexia. And it also has pervasive mental not otherwise specified, which is PD-NOS. I'll get on to PD-NOS in a minute because they're different in the two settings. So it's also interesting because what the autism spectrum is in both contexts is actually different as well, because in the DSM-IV, the autism spectrum is autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, and PD-NOS. And PD-NOS is interesting because it's a residual category, so it's meant to be applied when people do not meet threshold for the other categories available. And this is kind of standard because the DSM, going back for decades, has had residual categories for when people do not meet threshold for other categories. So And this is because the American Psychiatric Association accepts that people do not fit well into boxes, so they need to have residual categories to kind of hoover up people who don't meet threshold for other categories and stuff. Well, the autism spectrum in nuisance thinking is the autistic disorder and Asperger's syndrome. And we know this because we go back into a diagram. She's literally only got autistic disorder and Asperger's syndrome on it. She also tells us in the nuisance health supplementary notes that is what the autism spectrum is. It's just autistic disorder and Asperger's syndrome. So, if you look at pervasive mental disorder, that was specified, or which is PDD-NOS, it's a residual category for those not meeting threshold for autistic disorder or Asperger's syndrome in the DSM-IV. While in Nuisance it's when someone does not meet threshold for autistic disorder, Asperger's syndrome, PDA, or specific language impairment. So it's much broader in Nuisance and it also means that in Nuisance PDD-NOS is not part of the autism spectrum, while it is in the DSM-IV. And if you look at the kind of underlying kind of assumptions between the different groupings of what categories are in these pervasive mental disorders, in PD-NOS, it basically requires them to have social communication issues and restrictive repressive behaviours and interests. While for Newson, these issues need to have coding issues, which is either issues understanding or processing information related towards communication. So it can be social communication or kind of writing, for example, in dyslexia, like reading and writing. And yeah, they do not have to have restricted repressive behaviours and interests. And we know this because if you go back to the diagram that I showed you from page 599 in Nuisance 2003, it has specific language impairments, and they have no restrictive repressive behaviours and interests. So there's different axiologies underpinning these groups as well. And we also know that the autism spectrum is based on child impairment in both of these kind of groupings, but PDA again is not based on child impairment. It's also quite interesting because we know that Newson knows about the child impairment since like the early 1980s, because she used it to diagnose some autistic people back then, and there's like research saying that she did. But kind of moving on, so we know that the DSM-IV pervasive mental disorders grouping is narrower than Nuisance. And we know that Nuisance is broader because of specific language impairments, which have a prevalence rate between 3 to 7%. So that's substantially broader than the DSM-IV one, and it would obviously include many non-autistic persons. So what this means is that nuisance pervasive mental disorders is not the same as the DSM-IV one, which means that it's problematic, and I would say logical fallacy, to assume that autism has expanded to include nuisance pervasive mental disorders grouping. And it frankly, I don't think it has. Because for one, specific language impairments are not part of autism discussions at all, largely anyway. Although, sorry, that's a different tangent. So I'm going to move on to this. So supposedly the PDD pervasive mental disorders were replaced by DSM-V autism, and that's kind of where we got into. More specifically, they would argue that pervasive mental disorders grouping has become synonymous with autism, both in clinical practice and in kind of lay person's kind of general kind of public understanding. So that's kind of why PDA is part of the spectrum, because pervasive mental disorders are now kind of autism common parlance, but it just isn't really the case. And it still doesn't mean that you can assume that PDA is autism, because they're false equivalents. Like, they're not the same thing. Between, except what the public thinks of pervasive mental disorders is not the same as what's in nuisance. But I would point out that the DSM-IV autism subtypes were replaced by autism and the social communication disorder within the neurodevelopmental categories within the DSM-V. And this matters because it's not just these 3 autism subtypes in DSM-IV were replaced with one category, they were replaced by 2 within a broader chapter. And I'll get onto this point because it means that autism is a neurodevelopmental category. And it comes back to an important point for this example. It's also worth pointing out that the DSM-IV pervasive mental disorders had Rett syndrome, but that was excluded from the DSM-V for having specific biomarker evidence. So, and the entire point of this is that all the categories within the kind of DSM-5, they lack biomarker evidence. This is kind of like widely noted within the kind of psychiatric kind of literature. It's noted within the actual DSM-5 itself. It's noted by people who are involved with kind of creating the DSM-5. So the fact that Rett syndrome had specific biomarker evidence means that it had to be excluded. So yeah, I mean, I'm going to go back more broadly to the kind of very brief overview of kind of histories of categories which have social communication issues and restricted repetitive behaviours and interests. So, for a large part of the 20th century, the kind of categories that had kind of social communication issues and restricted repetitive behaviours and interests were seen as a form of childhood psychosis, particularly childhood schizophrenia. And at the time of when Nero Canna first proposed autism, he folded autism within childhood schizophrenia. So, but over that kind of time period between 1940s and 1980s, there were many other kind of proposed categories which had social communication issues and restricted repetitive behaviours and interests that were either subtypes of childhood schizophrenia or as kind of standalone categories. So there was a long history of debate around having kind of categories that are either subtypes within a dominant kind of category at the time or kind of outside of it. I'd point out that around 40 years ago, there was a paradigm shift in how these categories of social communication issues and restricted repetitive behaviours and interests were kind of conceptualised. So, as previously mentioned, they were viewed as a form of childhood psychosis, particularly as a form of childhood, particularly through childhood schizophrenia. But around the 1980s, childhood schizophrenia as a category just died out. It's now a dead diagnosis, and like no one's diagnoses it anymore. At a similar time, autism became understood to be something that's kind of intrinsic to the person, that it's kind of a way of being human, and it's kind of started to become viewed as a pervasive mental category, and it's when it kind of entered the DSM-III. It's also worth noting that if you look at Newton's work, she first got her first PDA cases in 1975, so that's during like childhood schizophrenia was being still widely diagnosed, so that's during a time of when these kind of categories were being viewed as a form of childhood psychosis. It's only in the 1980s that Newton kind of proposed the first diagnostic category grouping, which he called pervasive mental coding disorders, and it's got our own groupings. It's got our own categories, and so it's got autism with that's one. PDA is another. It's got aphasia and dyslexia, and so. She's got those categories in this diagnostic grouping that she created by herself, because those are ones that she was mainly encountering as part of her clinical practice. And it's also worth pointing out that Newton created this diagnostic grouping of hers before she actually created PDA's behaviour profile, because if you actually see the first diagram, which she's got this diagnostic grouping on, she seems questioning what is the social communication issues, what are the communication issues with PDA. I think she questions if it's got issues with understanding kind of like identity and shame. I have to go back and check it, but yeah, so kind of moving on, within the late 1980s to the early 1990s, the autism spectrum kind of becomes more kind of broadly accepted and becomes part of the pervasive mental disorders. And what I mean by that is it's kind of with the adoption of Asperger's syndrome, so that autism kind of becomes broadened out, and also with pervasive mental disorder not otherwise specified going on. It was only in around 1999 that Newton changed her pervasive mental coding disorder group into pervasive mental disorders grouping, and it kind of goes through another iteration before we get to her 2003 diagram. So yeah, so Newton's kind of playing catch up with how these categories have been seen over that kind of time period, and so I'm also trying to point out that these things are kind of, these categories are constructed, and there is a kind of broader evolution and history to go from. And I'm trying to point out that we're in quite an atypical time in terms of only having a single category for a single undividable category for social communication issues and restrictive and repressive behaviours and interests. And it kind of matters because the present autism criteria, they're not designed to create autism subtypes. It's designed to be undividable. We know this because it got rid of autism subtypes. It's not like with ADHD, for example, which has 3 subtypes. This autism just doesn't have them. There's also more of a broader issue in current kind of practice and research that there seems to be little interest within social communication disorder, which is a residual category within the DSM-IV for those who are not meeting threshold for autism. And this matters because there's a bit of a cliff edge now for those people who are not meeting threshold for autism diagnosis traditionally. So if you're about 20-30 years in the DSM-IV, anyone who's not meeting threshold for an autism diagnosis for autistic disorder or Asperger's syndrome, they would be given pervasive disorder not otherwise specified. But that safety net residual category doesn't seem to be in common use with autism under the DSM-V for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why. It just doesn't seem to be the case. And this is what I'm trying to say. We're in an atypical time of social communication disorders and our restrictive and repressive behaviours and interest categories, with there being only one undivided category in common use. And it kind of matters when you come to kind of PDA, because there are more than enough examples of PDA being diagnosed as a standalone category within the literature, within the academic literature on the topic. So some examples include Crane 2016, Newton itself has got over 150 cases, and Tronatell is a case study. I've got my previous 2 talks give more examples than this. This is just to show that PDA can be diagnosed as a standalone thing. And this kind of matters because, as I said earlier, autism itself is a neurodevelopmental category, which means that if one assumes that PDA Profile of Autism is a form of autism, or if you accept its underlying assumptions, it means that PDA Profile of Autism is intrinsic in a neurodevelopmental category. What that means is, it means that you can diagnose PDA as a standalone neurodevelopmental category if one wants to, because there are other examples of it within the academic literature. So what it means is that it's arbitrary to view PDA as a profile of autism when it can be attributed as a standalone neurodevelopmental category. This is how I'm showing that this is how PDA Profile is constructed as an example, because if one accepts the underlying assumptions of PDA Profile of Autism, there are enough examples of PDA being diagnosed as a standalone thing that it can be diagnosed as a standalone neurodevelopmental category. It's just not. From what I can tell, the PDA Profile of Autism aspects just don't care. They're not interested in doing that. So yeah. Well, there's also a kind of simple kind of thought experiments we can do to highlight that PDA Profile autism is constructed, and this is just simply to consider how one would conceptualise and clinically attribute PDA in different historical periods, such as either the 1940s or the early 2000s, and we got the academic literature would kind of give you massive hints over how one would do that. So the first one I mentioned previously is that Canna folded autism into childhood schizophrenia. And the second hint is, for the early 2000s, is that Newton evolved her pervasive mental coding disorders grouping into a variation of pervasive mental disorders grouping. So an entire point I'm pointing out here is that how one conceptualises and approaches clinically kind of attributes PDA will be different in different historical contexts because they are constructed categories themselves. So I'm moving on to the final example here, and it's only going to be a few slides. So yeah, PDA Profile of Autism central impairment is meant to be anxiety, which causes most, if not all, of the demand avoidance. So again, referring to this document is meant to be clinical practice by the PDA, clinical guidance by the PDA Society. So it gets problematic because the DSM-V autism criteria views anxiety as a co-occurring issue. It doesn't view anxiety to be part of the individual. And this gets more of an issue when you consider certain research results. So these are just some examples. So some examples are suggesting that PDA features predicted by hyperactivity, conduct problems, and anxiety. To PDA might be a triple hit of autism, conduct problems, and anxiety. I'm just going to quote this one from the abstract from White 2023. Both autistic traits and anxiety were unique and equally important predictors of demand avoidance. And this matters because basic logic tells us PDA cannot be something it is more than. So like A plus B plus C does not equal A. And there's also broader debates around autism subtypes within the academic literature, where things like anxiety and co-occurring issues are being debated if they should be viewed as part of autism or not, to make kind of autism subtypes. So this is a quote from Wasserbarth 2023b, but it's being made by profound autism advocates. So if you don't know what profound autism is, I've got videos on the topic. But so yeah, profound autism is another proposed autism subtype, but it's kind of being constructed using co-occurring intellectual disability and or language impairments. But this is kind of what Wasserbarth has said. So, in Wasserbarth et al. 2023, we argue that due to the high prevalence of co-occurring challenges among autistic individuals and the significant impact these challenges have on individuals' everyday lives, it is appropriate to consider including them as part of a formal classification system for autism severity. It is the nature of diagnostic classifications to evolve over time as more information is collected and a better sense of the condition is reached. When more autistic individuals are diagnosed with co-occurring anxiety than not, should anxiety be considered a co-occurring condition or a fundamental part of having autism contributing to its severity level? Question. That's from page 1 of this Wasserbarth et al. 2023b. As I'm trying to put out here is that there's active debates around if anxiety should be folded into autism or not. And the point I'm making here is in fact there's active debates going on if anxiety, which is meant to be such a part of PDA, is part of autism or a co-occurring difficulty. It tells us that autism itself has not expanded to include PDA features. It's certainly not expanded to include the central aspects of PDA. I would also question where the hell is demand avoidance as a central feature of autism within kind of clinical descriptions of it. I mean, from what I can tell, it's not anywhere really in there. But kind of moving on. So this is the final quote before I kind of get onto the concluding slides. So this is from an article that I Never's had published. So diagnostic categories as described in the American Psychiatric Diagnostic Manuals in brackets DSM-IV are not designed to map a large sections of a person's spiky profile. With residual categories commonly diagnosed, often pertinent parts of a person's spiky profile are missed during assessments. Consequently, the DSM-IV contains a section for cross-categorical tools and is common to have multiple diagnoses. Frequently, differences between diagnostic categories are arbitrary, with clinicians' bias affecting what a person is diagnosed with, such as through diagnostic substitution. That's from page 1 of Woods 2023. And the reason why I mention this is because the kind of psychiatric categories like autism, they're not designed to have features from other categories as arbitrarily lumped together with them to make other new categories. So, for example, they're not designed just to have anxiety lumped in with it and features of hyperactivity or impulsivity or kind of various conduct problems lumped in with them to make an autism subtype like PDA. Or they're not designed to have like learning is like intellectual disability and or kind of language kind of issues such as aphasia lumped together to make autism subtypes like profound autism. And the reason I'm making this out because I'm trying to point out that these categories are intrinsically socially constructed. I mean, for example, like profound autism is literally being constructed out of autism plus co-occurring intellectual disability and or co-occurring language impairment. So, yeah, this is the end of the third and final example. I've got 2 slides of reflective questions. I'm going to read them out. So, are there other examples indicating PDA profile autism is constructed, and just why? And is PDA profile of autism a rare autism subgroup before or after a 2016A assumed PDA is an autism subgroup and arbitrarily decided PDA is seen in less than 30% of autistics, and just why? And has autism expanded to include PDA features in part or entirety, and again why? Moving on to the next slide, and this is the final slide of the actual kind of talk, essentially, like besides the references. So yeah, can one assume a person is autistic due to being attributed with PDA? And again, why? If one accepts most assumptions underpinning PDA profile autism, can PDA be attributed as a standalone neurodevelopmental category? And just again, why? And then the last kind of question is, how should one conceptualize and clinically attribute PDA during the 2010s? And again, why? Kind of just justifying your answer. those are the kind of questions I want to get to, just to kind of get people to kind of reflect upon and justify their answers, and to kind of reflect upon the points that kind of presented. So this is my contact information. So this is my email address, my Twitter handle, ResearchGate link, which has most of my kind of conference talks and other materials on, and the channel you should be watching the video on. So this is the first reference slide. I'm not going to link on the reference slides too long, because you can either pause the video or see the link in the description for the video text, which has screenshots of references on. So this is the second reference slide. And yeah, I'm sorry this video is kind of overran longer than I had intended. I thought it'd be a bit less, considering there were more slides, but there was less text per slide. So yeah, so basically the word density per slide should have been less. But so that's the third reference slide. And this is the fourth one, which is second to last, because there's only 5 reference slides. And yeah, that's it. So thank you for your time, and I hope you found this video informative, and I hope you watch the next one.